Naruto characters are really strong. Pretty much all of the main cast reach unreal heights of power, with some of them reaching it at a young age, while others take a bit longer to get there. You've probably seen numerous videos ranking Naruto characters by strength, whether it be ranking the Akatsuki, the jonin, the konoha 12, or a variety of other categories. But one category that I never saw characters ranked by, in terms of power, is age. That is, until I released parts 1 and 2 of this series. So, in this third and final part of the video series, we'll be continuing doing just that. Going year by year and establishing who exactly is the strongest at each trip around the sun. In other words, today we'll be exploring and breaking down the strongest Naruto characters ranked by age, part 3. If you haven't seen the first two parts of this series yet, I implore you to go watch them after you watch this one, as watching it in order doesn't really matter, but I will quickly lay out the stipulations and a brief recap of where we left off. If you have already seen the last two, feel free to skip to this timestamp, you already know this stuff. As for the stipulations, they're the same as the previous two videos. No Otsutsuki, only human shinobi or those who have at least once been shinobi. We must be able to at least mostly determine how strong each character was at a given age. And finally, no Boruto exclusive characters, but we will include later forms of characters who are both in Naruto and Boruto. As for the recap, the last video covered ages 21 through 40, with our final section covering 36 through 40. The top 10 for that section was as follows: Hokage Kakashi, Kuretsuchi, Chojuro, Hashirama, Hiruzen, Tobirama, post-Izanagi Madara, and a three-way tie with the Sannin. I covered the reasons for all of these placements in the previous video, so make sure to go watch that after you get done with this if you have any questions. But in this video, we'll be covering ages 41 through basically 100. So buckle in, because it's now time to jump into our first placement. Since the number of notable characters in these age ranges are fairly limited, we'll be narrowing it down to a top 5 and just going decade by decade. So our first slot will be covering ages 41 through 50. At number 1, we have Boruto era Kakashi. This will be Kakashi at 46-ish from the Boruto era, including his feats from the Boruto anime and Kakashi Retsuden, both of which are canon, which means he's an absolute smoke demon. I have an entire video detailing how strong he is at various points, including this time frame, as well as a Hokage Kakashi versus Hashirama video that covers his power at this time in depth. So after this video, feel free to go check those out if you want more context, but here are the cliff notes. Kakashi is able to contend physically in terms of speed with the likes of Kashi and Koji, and even be considered a threat by Koji. This is the same base Koji who was able to go toe-to-toe with base Jigen, and was confident in his ability to take down Delta, a 6-path Seijuo Naruto level rival. Some will try to discredit the Koji stuff by saying it's a clone, but Koji's clones also contend with base Jigen, and since clones are consistently relative to the user in speed, these feats should consistently get Kakashi to at least that low Otsutsuki tier, likely no lower than base Hokage Naruto. Again, if you want to go in more depth on these feats and how cracked this version of Kakashi is, go check out those videos, they'll be linked in the description. At number 2, we have Darui. A lot of people don't know this, but Darui is actually 26 in Shippuden, making him 9 years older than Naruto, which means he'd be about 41 at the beginning of Boruto and 43 to 44 currently. But just how strong is this version of Darui? Aside from Naruto and maybe Gaara, I'd have Darui as the strongest in the Boruto era Kage. Darui not only outspeeds Momoshiki, he also clashes with him evenly and forces Momo to flee, trying to get distance on him to have a ranged fight. This is pre-absorption, but it's still impressive nonetheless. On top of these crazy physicals, Darui is the only person in the world who can wield Black Lightning, which prompts the Boruto movie databook to state that he has peerless lightning release. If you take this to its furthest logical conclusion, you could get his lightning release above even Sasuke's, or at least reasonably above Sasuke's lower level Raiton applications, such as the Chidori he used to stun Kinshiki. These things both get Darui's physicals as well as his attack potency to at bare minimum those low Otsutsuki levels fairly comfortably. At number 3, we have Hashirama. I think Hashirama should be in his mid to late 40s when he dies, maybe pushing 50, as he appears to be about 25 years older than Hiruzen, and Hiruzen is promoted to Hokage at roughly 20 to 22 years old, a few years after Hashirama's death, as Tobirama is the Hokage during the First War when Hiruzen is promoted. The reason you get this 20 to 22 years old range for Hiruzen becoming Hokage is he's 68 at the beginning of part 1, minus 12 years for Naruto's age to get to the Nine Tails attack, minus at least 2 years because Kakashi is 14 during the Nine Tails attack and he's 12 whenever he's promoted to Anbu, which likely happens at the end of the Third War, minus another 6 years because Kakashi was 12 at the end and no older than 6 at the beginning, minus another 7 at least for the Second War, as it's stated to be the longest war and therefore longer than the third, and minus another 20 years since there's 20 years of peace between the First and Second Wars. This gets Hiruzen to conservatively no older than 22 years old when he's promoted. This is important because Tsunade is 18 years younger than Hiruzen, and Hashirama is around long enough to at least see toddler Tsunade. So if you say conservatively she's like 2 years old, this means he would have died whenever Hiruzen was around 20 years old, leaving only a 1 to 2 year gap for Tobirama's Hokage reign, and more importantly for this video, Hashirama to have died between the ages of 45 and 50. That said, we all know how strong this dude is. I don't think I need to spend too much time on him here. He's just an absolute smoke demon. At number 4, we have another god of shinobi, Hiruzen. This should be prime Hiruzen, or at least approaching his prime, as most shinobi that we see continue to train are in their prime around their 40s to 50s, with the Sannin and Kakashi being really good examples of this. Hiruzen should be about 55 during the events of the Nine Tails attack, which should be a little bit post-prime, as he should be comparable to Hashirama in his prime, or at least base Hashirama. The reason I say this is because in order for people in Konoha to have hailed him as the strongest Hokage of all time, it would be necessary for him to at least be somewhat comparable to base Hashirama, and most people wouldn't know what Sage Hashirama can do, so I do exclude Sage Hashirama from those statements, but they should have a decent idea about how strong he was in base. We have good reason to believe that most people don't know how strong he really was at his peak, as his feats are considered fairy tale alongside the likes of Hagoromo. This means that most people wouldn't believe most of the insane stuff, and thus would be formulating their opinions on the less impressive stuff. There's also no reason for him to use Sage Mode against anyone but Madara, and those battles didn't take place in front of an audience. That said, being compared to base Hashirama is still crazy stock for obvious reasons. Finally, at number 5, we have Tobirama. Again, Tobirama should be unalived around his early 40s, as he should just be a few years younger than Hashirama, but this would be him with everything he has as an Edo, just moderately better stats. FTG, Edo Tensei, Shadow Clones, Unparalleled Water Style, you already know what it is. Kakashi hasn't reached this age yet, and neither did Hashirama or Tobirama, so they are all out. That said, coming in at number 1, we have Hiruzen. As I went over before, Hiruzen should be roughly 55 during the time of the Nine Tails attack, which was 12 to 13 years before Naruto's Chunin exams, at which point Orochimaru implies that if Hiruzen were only 10 years younger, he'd have no problem dealing with him. This is pretty astonishing considering the fact that the Sannin are all consistently considered to be on par with, if not stronger than, the 5 Kage. So since Minato died at 24 and is 10 years older than Kakashi and recommended him for Anbu when Kakashi was 12, which likely took place after his promotion to Hokage after the Third War, Minato was only Hokage for about 2 years, meaning Hiruzen was likely Hokage until he was about 53 or 54 years old, and it was only after that that he really started to decline, as he didn't have much of a reason to train as a retiree. That said, 51-year-old Hiruzen should hold most of the scaling he had in his prime, allowing for him to hold this spot. At number 2, we have post-Izanagi Madara. This would be Madara about 20 years after his final encounter with Hashirama, while he's cultivating his plans for return and to enact the infinite Tsukiyomi. However, this is, again, one-eyed post-Izanagi Madara, so he's not as strong as he otherwise would have been in his prime with both eyes. Obviously, we don't have a ton to go off of for this version of Madara, as he's essentially in hiding and we don't see anything from him, but it seems uncharacteristic of him to not train and hone his abilities, especially as he intentionally ate Hashirama's flesh to produce the Rinnegan, so he's probably trying to keep up his strength in the event that that just awakens one day. At number 3, we have Orochimaru. This would be Orochimaru at roughly 60, 5 years after the end of the Fourth War, now possessing an immortal Zetsu host body. I'm only considering the fact that he has the Zetsu body on top of what he had prior to, and nothing else at this point since we don't have any other feats, so keep that in mind. But I think he probably surpassed the other Sannin once he took on this host body, as it should increase his regenerative abilities and give him a body that won't break down and reject him, allowing for him to operate at full power and potentially give him even greater chakra than he had before, as obviously Zetsu would be made of Hashirama cells. If he was a rival to the other Sannin in a weaker vessel, which didn't amp him in these ways, it just tracks to me that he would be stronger than them after gaining it. Speaking of the Sannin, at number 4, we have a tie between Jiraiya and Tsunade. I think these two should hold the same spot since they're narratively rivals throughout the whole story, and Tsunade shouldn't get stronger post Jiraiya's death, at least not significantly. This may seem weird for a lot of people, but consider this. The Sannin are stated to rival the 5 5 Kage in the 10th Anniversary Guide, which covers up to the 5 Kage Summit. The summit takes place less than a week before the start of the war, and Tsunade is either traveling or doing diplomatic things in that time span, until having to arrive on the battlefield later. Tsunade is confident in stepping up to and facing off with A, an early KCM1 Naruto rival, at least in terms of speed, he's a rival to him, but Tsunade's confident in doing this even without using the massive increase in power granted to her through the Byakugo seal. What's interesting about this Sannin versus 5 Kage statement though, is that it is a reputation statement, but Obito also says that Jiraiya lived up to his reputation as a Sannin in his performance against Pain. If his reputation is being comparable to the 5 Kage, that should mean that this type of result could be expected from the likes of someone on A's tier. However, this might feel a bit weird as the idea of A being relative to KCM Naruto and KCM Naruto being over Sage Naruto, who most people have over Tsunade and Jiraiya, muddies this up a little bit. But let me clear this up. A is not relative to KCM Naruto as an overall combatant, only in terms of combat speed. So this doesn't mean that Tsunade and Jiraiya are necessarily on that KCM tier or beating him up, but they should be able to at least somewhat contend with that level of fighter to some degree, using their hacks abilities to mitigate any disadvantages they have, at least until Naruto starts spamming clones, which he doesn't do against A in the first place. Now, while I do think KCM Naruto is overall stronger than Sage Mode Naruto, as it's literally just stated by Naruto himself, I think that the gap between these two forms isn't enormous by any means. So it makes sense that Sage Naruto should have a similar performance versus people on that tier as KCM Naruto would, which is basically what we get with his encounter with the 3rd Raikage. What this does for the video though is it gets Tsunade and Jiraiya on, at least physically, a tier where they can compete with people like A and KCM Naruto, which then allows for us to acknowledge that they have superior arsenals to A, which would lead both of them to victory against him. Speaking of A though, next up we have A. Since A is 47 in part 2, he's approaching 50 during the last, and in this age range shortly after that. Since he still holds the title of Raikage, he's still the strongest in the village at that time, holding on to all of the scaling and feats that he has from the war arc. Now we're in the really old characters, like your grandma and grandpa old. But coming in at number 1, we have 70-year-old Boruto Orochimaru. This would be Oro when he went toe-to-toe with and defeated an inner Kara member, and even evaporated one of his subordinates in the blink of an eye. This Oro is clearly on that low Otsutsuki level of combatant, being able to compete with inner Kara members, all of whom possessed at least low Otsutsuki levels of power. Needless to say, this Orochimaru is an absolute monster. It's almost like that White Zetsu body I was talking about earlier made a big difference in his scaling. Speaking of monsters though, at number 2 we have Madara. Again, this Madara should continue to train, working his way towards a Rinnegan and his inevitable death, so I think he should maintain the ranking he had before. We see that characters tend to maintain their strength well into their 50s as long as they continue to train, but in their 60s is when they should start to see some sort of decline based on the Orochimaru statement from part 1 about Hiruzen 10 years younger, blah blah blah. So we should expect the same for Madara, but he also has an EMS to help him out, along with Hashirama's DNA likely amping him to some degree, so it's like, what do you want me to do? At number 3, we have Hiruzen. This is early 60s Hiruzen, who should still stand atop the shinobi world, being stronger than the other 4 Kage of the time, along with the Sannin at the beginning of part 1. As he approaches death at age 69 though, he would eventually start to even out with them to some degree, but at this point he should still be above them. Speaking of which, at number 4 we have Tsunade. This would be Tsunade from between the Hiden novels and the Boruto era, so she's definitely out drinking and gambling, as she was in Kakashi Hiden, but she was also doing that in the blank period between leaving Konoha and re-encountering Jiraiya, and yet still remained super strong, so I don't think she should fall off too far here. Also, she still has the Byakugo seal, so if she has atrophied to some degree in her combat ability, she could just use that as kind of a cheat code to get back to that power. Finally, at number 5, we have A. This should be A right around 62 years old in the Boruto era, and honestly, we don't have a lot to go off of, but we do know that he trains consistently in character, so it's likely he keeps that up and is able to maintain his physicals to some degree in the time between the last and Boruto. Interestingly, we know he's been retired for at least a little bit in the time of Boruto, as he's brought together with the other former Kage to talk about Momoshiki, but it's unclear when that transition of power took place, so it's very possible that he could have been the strongest in Kumo up until like a year prior to that, which would be absolutely insane, as Darui, as shown earlier, is an absolute monster. Alright, let's be real. These last two sections are what you guys are here for, the geriatric sections, right? So once again, in this category, we have Orochimaru at number 1. We know he trains and has an immortal body, so he should just maintain his strength or get even stronger in the 3-year time gap from part 1 of Boruto to 2 Blue Vortex. So Oro has to hold this spot even at 73. I mean, most other people would experience some sort of atrophy from age. He's not going to experience that. So he can only stay the same or get stronger unless you assume he's doing things to weaken himself. Next up, at number 2, we have Madara again. Like, what do you want me to do? Alright, he has an EMS, he can Genjutsu GG basically everybody on here, and likely can still use the Susanoo at some form. Oh, and he should have at least Danzo level physicals. I don't see any reason why Danzo, who was weaker than Madara, and Hiruzen, who was also weaker than Madara, can maintain that Kage level of physicals at 70-ish, but Madara can't. So he's gotta be here. However, since Hiruzen doesn't make it this far, and Tsunade is doing God knows what at this age, at number 3 we have Oniki. This would be 79-year-old Oniki during the Fourth War, with his Will of Stone returned. This Oniki is capable of evaporating entire Susanoos, as well as going toe-to-toe with the likes of Mu. I'm actually of the opinion that Oniki is probably the strongest of the Shippuden 5 Kage during the war, but that's up for debate. Regardless, he is an absolute beast. At number 4, we have Danzo. Danzo died at 73. Yes, Sasuke was beating up on a legit geriatric, so this would be Danzo fully equipped with all of his Sharingan, Wood Style, Kodo Matsukami, etc. I don't think I need to explain myself here. As much as I hate him, he's pretty strong for an old guy. At number 5, we have Chiyo. This lady is actually pretty impressive. She was able to battle with the likes of Sasori fairly evenly for a bit, at least up until he brought out the Iron Sand. And Sasori should obviously be at least on that low Kage tier of combatant. So you could give her better stocks if you take her War Arc stuff and assume that she's somewhere around KCM 1 Naruto, but I don't think that's the case. I don't think we can really take anything from that encounter. But even if you just take the Sasori stuff, I think she should be stronger than everyone else I would have below her in this age range. Okay, now these are the genuine old farts. I decided to combine these last 2 decades into one section because there aren't that many people who make it to this age in the Naruto world. Shocker, shinobi don't live a long time, so it's not really worth breaking it up into 2 separate sections. But at number 1, we have Mito Uzumaki. Now, here's the thing, we don't really know much of anything about how strong she was as an old woman, but what we do know is, number 1, she should be around her early 80s when she died. Number 2, she possesses the Byakugo seal, which should be able to amp her far beyond her normal means as an old woman. And number 3, she was an absolute monster in her prime. But just how strong was she at that time? Well, due to the fact that she's probably the one who taught Kushina all of her sealing jutsu, as the Uzumaki are scattered and mostly wiped out at that time, and she's the only other Uzumaki that we see in the Minato flashback, she should have all of the sealing jutsu that Kushina had, and thus the sealing jutsu that Kushina taught to Minato. This makes sense as well, since Hashirama's birthday column tells us that Kurama was sealed due to her aiding Hashirama, so she low-key may have sealed Kurama by herself. Something that supports this is the fact that Kushina, on death's door, body reeling from childbirth, implies that she's able to pull Kurama back into herself, likely using the Uzumaki chains, which Mito also should have. Something that's interesting about these chains is that they're stated to get stronger as the user gets older, so you could argue that she's got the strongest Uzumaki sealing chains of all time, especially since she shares a similar statement to Kushina about having a particularly powerful chakra even amongst the Uzumaki. That said, she should legitimately be able to handle Biju by herself even at 80 plus years old. At number 2, we have Oniki. Now this guy is low-key cracked. In Boruto, this man is around 100 years old and makes a particle style that eats up a large section of a castle, essentially, defeating a clone of his that was beating up on Boruto, Sarada, and Mitsuki simultaneously. I think he could whip out this jutsu and just one-tap everyone below him, to be honest. And also, Oniki is 79 during the war, so 2 years post-war shouldn't be too far removed from his War Arc self, meaning he should be able to replicate his War Arc feats, which I think should put him above anybody below him. But if anyone has a case to be above him, it's our number 3, Madara. This Madara is basically immobile, near death, and attached to the Geto Mazo. but he should also have the Rinnegan abilities as well as one-tap GG EMS Genjutsu. He probably also has some version of the Susanoo, and even if it's just the skeletal, we know that the Susanoo can be detached from the user and sort of autopiloted, so he might be able to just box people with the Susanoo while standing still and utilizing the Rinnegan abilities. If you go with higher end interpretations like that, I'd put him above Oniki, but, you know, Grandpa Madara is not to be trifled with. At number 4, we have Mr. Moneybags himself, Kakuzu. Kakuzu is 91 in Shippuden and obviously possesses frightening power. His 5 hearts, 5 chakra affinities, and near immortality, along with his insane durability, make him a nearly impossible opponent to bring down for basically any shinobi. Being able to go toe-to-toe with the likes of Kakashi puts Kakuzu comfortably in that low Kage tier of combatant, although Kakashi was handicapped and unable to use his trump card. But regardless, there aren't many 90-plus-year-olds who could do anything to this guy. And finally, rounding out this video and the series, we have Bunpuku. You may be wondering who this guy is, but don't worry, I got you. This old guy was the first Jinchuriki of the One-Tail Shukaku. The reason I have him here is because, well, there's basically nobody else. The only other contenders are Konoha's Council, Koharu, and Homura, both of whom are absolutely featless. At least with Bunpuku, we know that he was strong enough to be a Jinchuriki, and with his bond he produced with Shukaku, he should be able to borrow his power in times of need. This does admittedly require a bit of headcanon, but I do think it's reasonable since Shukaku considered Bunpuku to be alongside Hagoromo in terms of his relationship with the Bijou. As you can see, there are a lot of really strong characters in Naruto, even the old farts. But that being said, that is it for the strongest characters in Naruto by age part 3 and for the series. If you haven't watched the previous videos in this series, make sure you go check those out. They'll be linked in the description. And if you like the video, obviously make sure to like the video and, you know, hit that subscribe button if you love me. But thank you guys so much for making it all the way to the end. And until next time, have an awesome day.